Well, it's time to do some Spanish cruisers. And this is the Velasco Class, or the Velasco Class. They're an interesting group of ships. They are unarmored, unprotected cruisers. They are built between 1881 and 1889, and some of them managed to serve to 1927. The ones that reached 1927 are kind of rare. Some of them, though, do survive the Spanish-American War. Most don't. What can I say? They are built in two slightly different subclasses. The first two ships, Velasco and Gravina, are built by the Thames Ironworks and Shipbuilding Engineering Company in the UK. They had fewer but heavier guns and were slightly faster than the next six, which were built at various yards in Spain. The two British ships were laid down in 1881, but the last Spanish one not being 1889. They had what's called bark rigging style, as you can see here, an iron hull, a single tool funnel, and they are completely unarmored. Two were lost at sea, three were sunk during the Spanish-American War, and, well, the other three didn't have that good a career. So, their displacement, a little over 1,000 tons, 1,152 tons. Length, 210 feet. Beam, 32 feet. Draft, 13 foot, 8 inches. Bark rigged, 13 knot speed, complement 173. Infanta Isabel had 194 by 1921. The armament, Velasco and Gravina, two 6-inch 152mm guns, two 3-inch 76mm guns, two machine guns, two 14-inch torpedo tubes. The others, as built, 420mm 4.7-inch guns, 457mm 6-pounder guns, one machine gun, two 14-inch torpedo tubes. Now, just remember that the ships which found themselves in the Far East, in the Philippines, found themselves without any torpedoes. So, yeah, we have a torpedo tube, but we have no torpedoes. Infanta Isabel by 1921, one 66mm gun and 10 57mm guns, and probably is completely and utterly pointless in any scenario in 1921, because there are probably sloops in the Royal Navy which could have taken her out at that point. In fact, there are some Flower class sloops which probably carry heavier armament than she does, and are actually better able to fire it at range. And carrying 200 to 220 tons of coal in normal. This is Velasco. She's a good ship. They're all good ships, although I don't have pictures for all of them, so you will be seeing pictures of one of them rather a lot. It happens. The Velasco, well, her operating history is checkered, but she's launched in 1881, and she is commissioned soon thereafter. When the Spanish-American War begins in 1898, she's anchored in Manila Bay. She's part of Rear Admiral Patricio Montoya y Pason's Pacific Squadron. In the Battle of Manila Bay, she's still anchored there, and she's sunk during the battle. This is her. This is what happens when you have an unarmored ship where it doesn't have its most powerful weapons and is in a very bad state when your opponent turns up. This is the Gravina. But it's not the Gravina, because This is probably the Infanta Isabella, and which, again, is not quite correct for the Gravina because she was one of the British-built ships. But the Infanta Isabella picture turns up a lot as the one representing the class, and it's probably the best representation of their lines. Now, Gravina herself has 4 6-inch guns, 2 3-inch guns, 2 machine guns, and 2 14-inch torpedo tubes. She is based in the Philippines. She sunk in a typhoon in July 1884 with a loss of 2 officers and 7 crew. She is launched and entered service in pretty much 1881. She's lost after 2 years on station. This is the problem with having ships on foreign stations. You will lose them, sometimes to weather, because the sea is the thing you're fighting 365 days a year, every decade of every year. No, every year of every decade. Yeah. Sorry. The Infanta Isabel. Now, I managed to find a different picture of her for her, which I was able to use. Again, I will always freely admit that the pictures I usually use are the ones from Wikipedia because I know I'm allowed to use those. They tend to have our Wiki Commons license and are able for educational uses to be used. There are sometimes issues with other images. She is laid down in Cadiz. She's named for the Princess of Asturias, Isabella. She's laid down in 1883. She's launched in June 1885. She's completed in 1887. And she is the vessel which is stricken in 1927. In May 1893, Infanta Iulia visited the United States. Now, Iulia, trying to pronounce her name, she was traveling on the Infanta Isabel. She first traveled to Puerto Rico, then to Havana, then Cuba, arriving in New York in 18th May on the vessel, before making her way to Washington, D.C., where she was received by President Grover Cleveland at the White House. The Infanta Isabel stays on New York as part of the Grand Review going on there. She's rebuilt in 1911, and by 1921, as mentioned, her armament had become 1 66mm and 10 57mm guns. And to support these guns, her complement has risen to 194. But yes, she is used as a diplomacy ship, escorting the young princess around. And it makes sense. It's a fairly capable ship for doing that. Now, yes, there was a cruiser called the Infanta Isabel, and there is also another one called the Isabel II, named after Queen Isabella II. In the Royal Navy, that would be considered mildly confusing, considering some of the Spanish vessels were going to go for this as an anglicization of the name. She was built in Ferrol, laid down in 1883, launched in 1886, and completed somewhere between 1888 and 1889. Stricken in 1907. When the American War began, she was in San Juan, Puerto Rico. U.S. Navy, of course, established a blockade there. In June 1898, Isabel and the gunboat, the General Concha, and the destroyer Terror decided to come out and test the blockade. This resulted in the Second Battle of San Juan. Unfortunately, the USS St. Paul, the auxiliary cruiser, moved in, which resulted in, of course, a battle, which I've discussed before, and the Spanish quickly broke away. Unfortunately, the Isabel II and the General Concha could go no faster than 10 knots, so The Terror made a torpedo run on the St. Paul to try and cover the retreat, and is mauled by gunfire from the St. Paul, and the torpedo attack's unsuccessful. The three Spanish ships make it back successfully to the port of San Juan. 2 men were killed aboard the Terror, and they're the only casualties suffered by either side during the battle. 6 days later, the Isabella II, the General Concha, and the gunboat Ponce de Leon, always a good name to name thing to name a gunboat after, sortied to assist the Spanish blockade runner, the Antonio Lopez, the merchant steamer, making it into San Juan's harbour. They exchanged long-range fire with the St. Paul, the Yosemite, and the New Orleans. Neither side scored any hits, and, well, the Antonio Lopez was not able to get past the Americans, so the Spanish warships returned to port, where they spent the rest of the war. Lopez decided that it was run aground, and most of the cargo was successfully unloaded by the Spanish. The Cristobal Colon, which again I've used the same picture for because, well, it's standing in for representing all of them. Her operational history is just as interesting. She's named for Christopher Columbus. She's built in La Caracha shipyard, Cadiz. She's launched in 1887. She's completed in either 1888 or 1889, depending on who you're talking to. And she foundered in the 29th of September, 1895. Yes. She made a top speed of 15 knots on sea trials, which was the highest speed attained by any cruiser of this class, but didn't achieve it again in the rest of her entire career. She was sent to the Caribbean, and she foundered during well, how do I put this? She foundered during rough-ish weather in Pinar del Rio, Cuba, and it was a hurricane which passed over the wreck. Well, she was founded on the 29th of September. The hurricane passed over her wreck on the 1st of October, and that really broke her up and made her completely unsalvageable. Up until that point, there had been some discussion about possibilities, maybe it's, after the first 2 days, maybe we can, maybe no. Hurricane goes over and bye-bye. Yeah, I'm going in the right direction. Oh, you're going to want to guess what happened to Don Juan de Austria? Well, the Don Juan de Austria was built in Cartagena. She was laid down in 1883, launched in 1887, and guess what? We're not sure, completed 1888 or 1889. And she is sunk in 1898 and captured and salvaged by the US Navy. Now, she had a bit of an interesting career. At one point, she is part of the naval division, basically a cruiser division centered on unprotected cruisers, which are sent to reinforce Spain's Adriatic squadron in the Philippines. And the idea is we're going to send ships out there because that looks good. But they are Don Juan de Austria, Castilla, and Don Antonio de Ulia, which is one of her sister ships. They're all unprotected cruisers. You're sending unprotected cruisers to reinforce your holding in the Philippines. That's not really sensible if you're worried about your threat being America. They went out there, calling at Barcelona, Port Said, Suez, Aden, Colombo, and Singapore. They arrived in Manila in 1890, and they stayed there. They became known as Black Squadron because its ships were painted black instead of white, as the other Asiatic squadron ships were. They were under the command of a gentleman called Manuel de la Caramara, who was technically a captain but was called the Commodore of the division. Unfortunately, in December 1890, he was forced to relinquish command because of illness. Don Juan de Austria remained in the Philippines, and she's part of the squadron of Patricia Montoya Passon. At 1100 hours on 25th April 1898, her and the five other ships of the squadron set out for Subic Bay. However, after they arrived there, they found that a few of the mines had been laid and the shore batteries had not been mounted, so they departed and returned to Manila Bay. Now, remember, they moved from Subic Bay to Manila Bay because they were exposed to from Manila Bay to Subic Bay because Subic Bay was supposed to be defended. Subic Bay wasn't. So they returned to Manila Bay, which was also not really defended. There were, though, some shore batteries which, in theory, could support Montoya's squadron, and where the shallow water might reduce the loss of life in the Spanish ships if they were sunk. During the battle, Don Juan d'Austria was at the extreme end of Montoya's line, and, well, it got underway in an unsuccessful attempt to try and close the American warships. Always brave to do in an unarmored, unprotected cruiser. And basically, it was just blasted. She tried to go to the aid of Castilla when Castilla was burning out of control and had to be abandoned. And when Montoya's flagship, the other also unprotected cruiser, Reina Cristina, also was knocked out of action, Jewish squadron actually ended up, this is the American ships, concentrating their fire on the Don Juan de Austria. That's nice of them. Because she showed spirit. She ends up being scuttled in shallow water. After the battle, a boarding party from the USS Petrel, the gunboat, went aboard and set the wreck on fire. She'd already been burned. After the war, the US Navy raised and salvaged her and commissioned her into US Navy in 1900 as the gunboat USS Don Juan de Austria, which I just think is rude myself, but I can understand why they did. And she actually stays in US service till October 1919. Well, June 1919. She sold in October 1919. I just find that cruel. Basically, unprotected cruisers are sloops. They're present ships, but they should not be engaging in fleet actions. So, Don Antonio de Ulloa. Now, her operational history is much the same as her sister's. She went to the Philippines under Manuel de la Camara, and she stayed in the Philippines. Mostly as an idea to counter the threats of the German Empire, which were also sending protected cruisers out there and armored ships. It happens. She was actually had a machinery in such bad condition by the spring of 1898 that it was all removed to be overhauled. This meant she was immobilized off Cavite Manila Bay. Her port battery was removed to be used to reinforce the shore batteries, and she was left with only her starboard battery aboard and only about half her crew, which was enough to use that battery. This is the condition she's in when war breaks out in April 1898. And this is the condition she's in when she's riddled and blown apart and found post-war to be beyond salvage and repair, and so she's broken up for scrap. And finally, we have the last of the ship of the class, the Conde del Venendito. She sunk as a target in 1936. What's funny about this ship is, if anything is threatening to the Americans, and anything can be said to be a Spanish provocation to the Americans directly, well, the instant she gets involved in could be seen as it. She participated in the quadricentennial of Christopher Columbus discovering the New World. This actually also ended up leading to a scenario where the royal family, the UK, the British royal family, used the ship for reception. In 1894, she participated in the training and evolutionary squadron of the Spanish Navy, which was located off the coast of Cuba, and was supposed to demonstrate the development of the Spanish Navy by 1894, and did not in any way at all make the Spanish Navy look even less developed than it actually was. The Atlanta incident took place in March 1895, and this was an interesting incident because, well, basically, there's an American merchant ship, Atlanta, off Cape Masai, Cuba. They are under suspicion for smuggling arms to the insurgents in Cuba. So, the Spanish vessel, the Conde de Venadito, attempts to stop her. The Spanish vessel ends up firing several solid shots on a merchant ship during an unsuccessful chase. The American ship gets away. And this leads to a lot of sensational reporting. So basically, she was trying to stop a vessel as part of her customs duty. But her top speed was 14 knots, and that vessel managed to pull away. And her firing her guns, she probably didn't. She was firing to stop, firing to impede, firing to warn, not firing to kill, mainly because they're flying the American flag. But this means she's at a disadvantage, and they get away, which makes Spain look weak, but also at the same time, making them look weak, does start off quite a lot of anti-Spanish sentiment in American press. Now, during the Spanish-American War itself, she took part in the defense of Havana. She steamed out of the harbor alongside Nueva España on the 14th of May to sort of maneuver in reaction to US gunboats. They then retreated, and at night the US vessels occupied the harbor. On 10th of June, Venadito, Nueva España, Clarke, and Yanez Pinzon appeared. They attacked US vessels, but unfortunately, when they sort of backed up to keep away from the US batteries and US vessels, they lost their impact, they lost their effect, and the US ships were able to enter the harbor. They tried. That is something this class repeatedly do. They try. They try a lot. You have to have respect for a class of tryhards, and they really do try. But they are built for the wrong world. It's one of those things when I start talking about protected and unprotected and armored cruisers, you more and more start to come back to what is called the small navy paradox. Small navy paradox is this: the fewer ships you have, the more those ships you have to count. The more ships those ships you have the more ships have to count, the more expensive they're going to be. The more expensive they're going to be, the fewer ships a small nation can afford. So it becomes a vicious cycle. If you're a large nation with a large fleet that has a solid core of very heavily powerful ships. You can afford to have large numbers of these relatively lightly armed, unprotected vessels. Because the odds are in a wartime, you're going to have more than enough of the actual fighting vessels to take on the fighting duties, leaving these vessels to carry out presence and constabulary duties and not get involved in the actual war fighting. Or if they do, be involved in a tangential and assisting manner rather than leading the battle fleet. But if you're a small nation with a smaller fleet, every single ship you have is going to have to count, and every ship is. This is a problem for nations in this period. That's a problem for nations for every period. The Velasco class are a class which a large nation would build. A nation with a large navy, a powerful navy would build. They're a ship and a class which a nation which is seeking to do presence and constabulary duties for a maritime empire will build. But they aren't vessels which should ever be involved in warfighting. They are far closer to an OPV in that regards, in modern parlance, than they are to a frigate. Now, this is not to say they don't have power. An unprotected cruiser should probably be able to beat an auxiliary cruiser and maybe have a chance against another unprotected cruiser. And if it has sufficient firepower, maybe even against a protected cruiser. But if you're a small unprotected cruiser with few guns and small guns at that, then you have a double whammy scenario. Because you neither have the firepower to score a quick victory if you manage to get your hits in quickly, nor do you have the protection necessary to keep fighting and take some hits. Honestly, the question is, where does the cost point work out at? And that's the question I'm going to finish this on with. And by cost point, I mean this. Do you build unprotected, protected, or armored cruisers if you're a small, medium, or large nation? And in what kind of ratio do you build them? And because just setting this as a random theoretical is rather cruel, I'm going to give you this as a question of nations which I haven't touched on. Now, it was tempting to go with Albonia, but that tends to be humorous and trying to be cruel to them, and I'm not that way inclined. So here is the question. You are an admiral in charge of the fleets of either Norway, Italy, or Brazil. You have to decide how you're going to spend your budget. And you have to justify whatever ratios you build in terms of cruisers. Your government has turned around to you and said, we want presence, we want security, and we want the ability to interdict and protect commerce. Look at those nations: Italy, Norway, Brazil. Work out what you would build in terms of the 1870s to 1890s. Unprotected, protected, and armored cruisers. What are you going to build? And in what ratio? Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed and hope you found the Velasco's interesting. Thank you again for all your support. It wouldn't be possible to do all this without your support. Thank you for the super chats. Thank you for the super thanks. Thank you for the subscriptions, the patrons. Thank you for the shares and likes. Thank you.